They gave me 2 cardboard boxes, a forced smile, and a goodbye that tasted like poison. What they didn't know, I had already duplicated the audit logs, backed up the metadata, and traced every phantom vendor across 3 shell firms. They fired a compliance officer. Without realizing, I was still under oath. Now I had nothing to lose except the truth. And I planned to deliver it in court, stay until the end, because this isn't just a firing, it's a $5.1 billion corporate funeral, and the CEO bought the casket himself. My name is Lauren Whitfield, and for 12 years, I believed in the integrity of corporate compliance. That belief died at 11:57 p.m. on a Tuesday night, when my phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. The subject line was clinical. Immediate action required. Employment status update. No greeting, no context, just 3 sentences that severed my career like a scalpel through tissue. Effective immediately. Your employment with Harson Dynamics has been terminated. Your access credentials have been revoked. Security will assist you with collecting your personal belongings tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I sat in my home office, staring at the screen. The cursor blinked in the darkness, mocking me. 12 years? 12 years of catching discrepancies, flagging irregularities, protecting this company from itself. And this was how it ended, not with a conversation, not with an explanation, just digital execution in the dead of night. My laptop screen still displayed the internal audit report I'd submitted 6 hours earlier. Report HD 2924-317. Routine quarterly review of vendor payments. Nothing that should have triggered this response. Unless. I scrolled through the report again, this time with different eyes. Page 47. The anomaly I'd flagged in accounts payable. 3 new vendors added in the past quarter, all with payment terms that didn't match our standard contracts. I'd recommended further review. Following protocol. Standard procedure. By the book. The house was silent except for the hum of my computer. My husband was traveling Singapore this week. London the next. The kids were away at college. It was just me and the ghost of my career, sitting in the blue glow of betrayal. I reached for my work phone already dead. The email had said, immediate, and Harson's IT department was nothing if not efficient. But they'd made one mistake. They'd sent the termination notice to my personal email, the one linked to my home computer, the computer where I'd been backing up my work files for the past 3 years, ever since my predecessor, Margaret Huang, had been escorted out without warning after 15 years of service. Margaret. I remembered her final day, how security had hovered while she packed, how they'd checked every item she touched, how they'd deleted her access while she was still in the building. She'd called me that night, voice shaking. They said it was restructuring, she'd whispered. But Lauren, I'd just filed a report about the Singapore accounts. Be careful. I'd been careful. Maybe not careful enough. My fingers moved across the keyboard, muscle memory taking over. The backup drive was hidden in a partition labeled Family Photos 2019. Inside were copies of every audit report, every flagged transaction, every email chain that had made me pause over the past 3 years. Call it paranoia, call it insurance. Margaret's departure had taught me that loyalty was a one-way street at Harson Dynamics. The timestamp on my termination email bothered me. 11:57 p.m. Who sends termination notices 3 minutes before midnight? It felt deliberate, calculated to catch me off guard, to ensure I'd have 8 hours of sleepless anxiety before security arrived. I opened my filing cabinet, the physical one, not the digital. Old habits from the pre-cloud era that IT always mocked me for maintaining. Inside were printed copies of key documents, including the one I'd been reviewing earlier that day, our third-party vendor compliance policy, dated January 2019, signed by the previous CEO, Robert Harson himself. Section 4.2.1. All third-party vendors must undergo legal origin verification every 6 months. No exceptions, no overrides. This clause remains in effect until formally amended by board resolution. I'd never seen a board resolution amending it. More importantly, in 3 years, I'd never seen anyone enforce it. The new vendors I'd flagged today, No origin verification on file. No documentation trail. Just approvals with a single signature, Grayson Bell, our current CEO. Robert Harson's golden boy who'd taken the helm after the old man's retirement. My personal phone buzzed. Text message from Anna in accounts payable. Heard the news? This is fucked up. Check your personal email. Deleting this in 60 seconds. I refreshed my inbox. New message. No subject line. From an address I didn't recognize. Inside was a single attachment, a screenshot of an internal memo dated yesterday. Effective immediately. All vendor audit reports are to be routed through the CFO's office before distribution. No exceptions. G.B. Grayson Bell. The boy wonder who'd transformed Harson from a steady industrial firm into a Wall Street darling. Stock price up 300% in 2 years. Magazine covers. Cable news appearances. The kind of CEO who used words like disruption and paradigm shift without irony. I'd met him exactly 3 times in 2 years. Each time, he'd look through me like I was furniture. Compliance was a necessary evil in his world, a speed bump on the highway to profit. But yesterday's memo, that was new, that was targeted. The clock on my computer read 12:41 a. In 7 hours and 19 minutes, security would knock on my door. They'd watch me pack 12 years into cardboard boxes. They'd check my bags for company property. They'd escort me out like a criminal while my colleagues averted their eyes. But 7 hours was a lot of time. Time enough to document everything. Time enough to preserve what they thought they were burying. Time enough to understand why Report HD 2024-317 had signed my death warrant. I started with the vendor files. 3 companies, all registered within the past 6 months. NextGen Solutions, Infinity Partners, Meridian Logistics, generic names, Delaware registrations, no web presence beyond basic landing pages, the kind of shells that looked legitimate on a cursory review but dissolved under scrutiny. Payment patterns were the tell. Regular monthly transfers, always just under the threshold that required additional approval, always processed on the last business day of the month, always approved by the same accounts payable clerk someone hired 6 months ago, directly recommended by the CEO's office. I cross-referenced the amounts with our revenue reports. The numbers were clever, designed to hide in plain sight. Each payment matched legitimate expense categories: consulting fees, logistics support, system upgrades. But the total. Over 18 months, these 3 vendors had extracted $43 million from Harson Dynamics. $43 million. I sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't just vendor fraud. This was systematic. This was planned. This was why Margaret Huang had been disappeared, and why I was next. The house creaked in the darkness. Every sound made me jump, wondering if they'd decided 8 a.m. was too generous, if security might arrive early. But the night remained quiet, giving me time to dig deeper. By 3 a.m., I'd found the pattern. The shell companies weren't just receiving money, they were part of a larger network. Payments in from Harson, payments out to overseas accounts, a washing machine for corporate funds, spinning money until its origin was untraceable. By 4 a.m., I'd found the connection that made my blood run cold. Buried in state incorporation documents, hidden behind layers of registered agents and nominee directors, was a name: Ryan Bell, Grayson's cousin, the same Ryan Bell who'd been quietly hired as a consultant 2 years ago, right around the time the first shell company was registered. By 5 a.m., I'd backed up everything twice. Once to the cloud service I'd paid for personally, encrypted and password protected. Once to physical drives I'd hide before security arrived. By 6 a.m., I'd made my decision. They could take my job. They could take my access. They could escort me out like a common thief, but they couldn't take what I knew. And more importantly, they couldn't stop me from what I was about to do. Because in firing me at 11:57 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Harson Dynamics had made one crucial error. They'd forgotten that as Chief Compliance Officer, I wasn't just an employee. I was a licensed professional with ongoing legal obligations. Obligations that didn't end with a midnight email. obligations that included reporting suspected fraud to the appropriate authorities. I smiled for the first time since my phone had buzzed. They thought they were burying a problem. Instead, they'd lit a fuse. 7:58 a.m. The doorbell rang. I walked to the door. Cardboard boxes already packed. Backup drives safely hidden. Evidence meticulously preserved. I opened the door to find 2 security guards and someone from HR, their faces professionally neutral. Ms. Whitfield, we're here to assist you with collecting your belongings. I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. Of course, I'm ready. Ready for more than they could possibly imagine. The pattern became clear only after I was gone. 3 times in 6 months. My reports had been delayed, rerouted, or simply vanished into the bureaucratic ether. Each time, the interference came from the same source, a financial analyst named Derek Morse, hired personally by Grayson Bell 8 months ago. I discovered this pattern 2 weeks after my termination. Sitting in my home office at 3:12 a.m., surrounded by printed emails and timeline charts. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Every hour brought new connections, new evidence of a systematic effort to silence the compliance department. My phone buzzed, another encrypted message from my network inside Harson former colleagues who remembered what integrity looked like. This one was from James Park, senior auditor. Using a burner email. Found what you asked about. Morse intercepted your Q3 report, sat on it for 2 weeks. When accounting asked, he said you were revising for accuracy. You never knew. I stared at the message, pieces clicking into place. The Q3 report had identified suspicious patterns in marketing expenses. I'd submitted it on September 15th. It reached the board on October 1st, edited, sanitized, with my key findings buried in footnotes. I'd assumed it was standard corporate filtering. Now I knew better. The timeline was damning. Every report that questioned vendor payments, every audit that dug too deep into financial flows, all had passed through Derek Morse's desk. And Derek Morse reported directly to the CEO, bypassing the normal chain of command. My laptop chirped. Video call request from Margaret Huang, my predecessor. I'd reached out to her after my termination, and she'd agreed to speak, but only through encrypted channels. Only after midnight. Only with video to confirm we were both alone. Her face appeared on screen, older than I remembered, marked by stress. Behind her, a generic hotel room. She'd been living nomadically since leaving Harson, too paranoid to settle anywhere. They did the same thing to me, she said without preamble. The pattern, the delays, the mysterious edits. I had 6 reports buried before they fired me. What triggered it? I asked. What made them move against you? She laughed, bitter and short. I found the Cyprus connection, shell companies routing money through Cyprus banks. Traced one back to a familiar name. That's when my reports started disappearing. Cyprus. I pulled up my files, cross-referencing with her timeline. 3 of the shell companies I'd identified showed banking relationships in Cyprus. The same banks, the same routing numbers, the same patterns Margaret had discovered 18 months ago. They're getting sloppy, Margaret continued. When they buried my findings, they were careful. New companies, new routes, but they're recycling the old infrastructure. That's why they had to move against you. You were seeing what I saw. Who else knows? I asked. Inside, maybe a dozen people who've noticed pieces. Outside? She shrugged. That's the question, isn't it? Who do you trust when the rot goes all the way to the top? After we ended the call, I returned to my charts. The pattern wasn't just about buried reports, it was about timing. Every interference coincided with board meetings, earnings calls, or investor presentations. Someone was managing the flow of information, ensuring that bad news never reached the people who mattered. My doorbell rang at 4:20 a.m. My heart stopped. Nobody visited at this hour unless... Through the peephole, I saw David Kim, head of IT security at Harson. Former head. Actually, he'd been terminated the same day I was. He looked exhausted, holding a laptop bag and constantly checking over his shoulder. I opened the door. David, what are you? They fired 17 people, he said, pushing past me. All on the same night, all from compliance, audit, or IT security, anyone who might have seen the patterns. 17 people. The scale took my breath away. This wasn't targeted termination, this was a purge. David pulled out his laptop. Before they locked me out, I grabbed something. Server logs showing who accessed what files. Look at this. The data scrolled past thousands of entries showing file access, modifications, deletions. One pattern jumped out immediately. Derek Morse's credentials. Accessing files he had no business touching. Compliance reports, audit trails, vendor documentation. Always late at night. Always just before the files were modified. He's not just intercepting reports, David said. He's altering them, changing numbers, deleting sections, adding approvals that were never given. I have timestamps showing your original submissions versus what reached the board. It's systematic falsification. I studied the logs, my anger building with each entry. Months of work, carefully doctored, findings neutered, warnings silenced, red flags painted green, and all traceable to one man acting on someone's orders. There's more, David continued, pulling up another screen. 3 days before the purge, someone accessed the HR system, downloaded the personal files of everyone in compliance and audit, home addresses, phone numbers, emergency contacts. They wanted to know everything about us before they moved. The violation felt physical. They hadn't just taken our jobs, they'd studied us like targets, planned their attack with military precision. I thought about my husband traveling, my kids at college. Had they factored that into their timing, hit me when I was alone, vulnerable. My phone buzzed. Another message from my network. This one from Rachel Torres in legal. Board meeting tomorrow. Emergency session. Grayson presenting organizational restructuring to improve efficiency. Your replacement already lined up. Derek Morse promoted to Chief Compliance Officer. Derek Morse, the architect of the cover-up, promoted to run the very department meant to prevent it. The irony was so perfect, it had to be intentional. A message to anyone thinking about following in my footsteps: play ball, or be replaced by someone who will. David was still scrolling through data. Wait, look at this. The vendor companies you flagged there are more, dozens more, different names, same structure. The 43 million you found, that's maybe 10% of it. 10%, I did the math. Feeling sick. Over $400 million, potentially, bleeding out of Harson Dynamics into a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, phantom vendors, the largest corporate fraud I'd ever encountered, operating in plain sight. Why now? I asked, more to myself than David. Why the sudden purge? They've been running this for 2 years. What changed? David pulled up another file. IPO documents. Harson's planning another public offering next quarter. $5 billion valuation. They need clean books for the SEC filing. $5 billion. The number from my nightmare. The fraud I'd promised to expose. Now I understood. They weren't just covering up past theft. They were preparing for the biggest score yet. A public offering based on fraudulent financials. Selling shares to unsuspecting investors while insiders cashed out. We need to move fast, I said. Before they lock down everything, before the IPO proceeds, we have evidence, but we need more. We need the full network mapped, the beneficiaries identified, the money traced. David nodded. I know others who were purged, good people who kept records, saved files, noticed things. If we pool our information, a coalition of the terminated, I said with dark humor. 17 angry ex-employees with nothing to lose and everything to prove. As dawn broke outside, I thought about the symmetry. They'd moved against us in darkness, thinking we'd scatter like roaches when the lights came on. Instead, we'd found each other, compared notes, connected dots they thought were invisible. The pattern of silence they'd worked so hard to maintain was breaking, not from inside Harson Dynamics, where fear kept people quiet, but from outside, from the discarded, the silenced, the ones they'd thrown away too carelessly. I looked at David, at the evidence spread across my dining room table. at the messages from fellow exiles plotting in the shadows. They'd created their own worst nightmare, a network of people who knew their secrets, had nothing left to fear, and everything to gain from the truth. "They should have left us alone," I said quietly. David smiled grimly. "Too late now. So what's our next move?" I picked up my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the number I'd saved but never thought I'd use. My old law school roommate, now an SEC enforcement attorney. Someone outside Grayson Bell's reach, outside Harson's sphere of influence. "Now," I said, "we make some noise they can't silence." The pattern was clear. The evidence was mounting, and 17 angry voices were about to become impossible to ignore. Grayson Bell was everything wrong with corporate America wrapped in a $10,000 suit. At 35, he'd inherited the CEO position not through merit, but through blood Robert Harson's chosen successor, groomed from birth to take the throne. I'd watched his rise with the fascination of someone observing a slow-motion train wreck, knowing the damage would come, but powerless to stop it. The transformation of Harson Dynamics under his leadership had been swift and brutal. The steady manufacturing firm that had employed thousands for 50 years became a financial shell game, its stock price soaring on promises and projections, while its foundation rotted from within. Grayson spoke in TED Talks about reimagining industrial paradigms, while gutting the factories that built actual products. I pulled up his corporate biography on my laptop, studying the professionally lit headshot. Square jaw, perfect teeth, eyes that promise shareholders the world. While picking their pockets, Harvard MBA. Of course, 2 years at McKinsey. Naturally, the resume of someone who'd never worked a real day in his life, but could make PowerPoints that made grown investors weep with joy. But I knew things that weren't in his bio, like how he'd forced out the old CFO 6 months after taking over, replacing him with someone more flexible, how he'd restructured the board, loading it with college friends and family connections, how he'd systematically removed anyone who might question his methods, painting it all as modernization. The vendor scheme had started small. I traced it back to his first year, following the paper trail David and I had assembled, a single shell company, approved for consulting services, 50,000 here, 75,000 there, testing the waters, seeing what he could get away with. Then came the acceleration. Month by month, new vendors appeared. The amounts grew larger. The approvals came faster. By year 2, it was a full-blown operation, siphoning millions while the board congratulated him on cost reductions and efficiency improvements. My phone rang at 2:33 a.m., unknown number, but I'd been expecting this call. "Ms. Whitfield." The voice was young, nervous. "This is Bradley Thompson. I work in accounts payable at Harson. They fired me yesterday." Another domino falling. "What happened, Bradley?" I questioned a payment. Meridian Logistics, $3.7 million for supply chain optimization. I couldn't find any documentation, no deliverables, nothing. I flagged it to my supervisor. 2 hours later, security was at my desk. I added his name to my growing list. 19 terminations now, all within a 2-week window, all people who'd touched the fraud in some way, even peripherally. "Bradley, do you still have access to any documentation?" Yes. I forwarded emails to my personal account. I know I wasn't supposed to, but something felt wrong. The approval signature on that payment, it was Grayson Bell himself. Why would the CEO personally approve a random vendor payment? Why indeed? Unless that vendor was special, unless that payment was part of something larger. After Bradley hung up, I returned to my investigation. The shell companies were registered in Delaware, but their bank accounts told a different story. Cyprus, Cayman Islands, Switzerland. The money flowed out of Harson and disappeared into the international banking system, leaving only breadcrumbs for anyone brave enough to follow. But one name kept surfacing in the corporate registrations, hidden behind layers of paperwork: Ryan Bell, Grayson's cousin, his childhood friend, his shadow throughout their privileged upbringing. Officially, Ryan worked as an independent consultant. Unofficially, he was the bagman for the family business. I'd found a photo from a Harson Company picnic 2 years ago. Grayson at the microphone, all charm and charisma, but in the background, barely visible, Ryan Bell talking intently with Derek Morse, the puppet master and his strings, caught in a moment they thought no one would notice. The pattern was clear now. Grayson provided the access and authority. Ryan managed the shell companies. Derek Morse handled the internal cover-up, a trinity of fraud, each protecting the others, all bound by greed and the certainty that they were too smart to get caught. My investigation led me deeper into Grayson's history, the failed startup before Harson, quietly buried by family money, the SEC investigation at his previous company that mysteriously went nowhere, the trail of former associates who signed NDAs and disappeared from the industry. This wasn't his first fraud. It was just his biggest. I found myself studying the organizational changes since Grayson took over. 5 CFOs in 3 years. Anyone who showed too much interest in the books was promoted to a special advisory role and then quietly pushed out. The entire internal audit function restructured 4 times, each iteration weaker than the last. The compliance department, my department, systematically neutered until it was just theater. But the masterstroke was the vendor management system. Grayson had personally overseen its implementation, selling it to the board as a modernization initiative. In reality, it was a fraud superhighway, designed to move money with minimal oversight. The very system meant to prevent vendor fraud had been architected to enable it. My doorbell rang at 4:15 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw Susan Martinez, former head of internal audit, another member of the Purged, clutching a box of documents. "I kept copies," she said when I let her in. "Everything they told me to shred. I copied first. Look at this." She spread papers across my table, internal memos, board presentations, email threads, a chronicle of Grayson's systematic dismantling of every control that might have stopped him. One document stood out, a presentation from 18 months ago, where Grayson proposed changing vendor approval limits. Instead of multiple signatures for large payments, he'd argued for streamlined decision-making. The board had approved unanimously, charmed by his talk of efficiency and trust. "He planned this from day one," Susan said. "Every change, every restructuring, every new policy, all designed to make the fraud easier." I thought about Robert Harson, the company founder, now in comfortable retirement in Florida. Did he know what his chosen successor was doing to his legacy? Or was he too blinded by familial pride to see the truth? The real tragedy was how unnecessary it all was. Harson Dynamics was profitable, stable, a good company with good products, but good wasn't enough for Grayson Bell. He needed spectacular. He needed to be the genius who transformed a stodgy manufacturer into a financial powerhouse. And if the transformation was just smoke and mirrors, theft and lies, well, that was just details. My laptop beeped with a news alert. Harson Dynamics stock up another 3% on rumors of the upcoming IPO. Analysts praising Grayson's leadership, his vision, his bold strategies. If they only knew that those strategies involved stealing from the company he was supposed to protect. I pulled up the IPO prospectus draft, leaked to me by another ally inside. The financial projections were fantasy, built on the assumption that the hemorrhaging of funds would somehow stop. The risk factors section was a masterpiece of omission, failing to mention that the CEO was running a personal ATM through the vendor system. $5 billion valuation, based on fraudulent numbers, hidden losses, and executive theft. When this bomb exploded, it wouldn't just take down Grayson Bell. It would destroy retirements, crush small investors, and taint everyone who'd ever believed in Harson Dynamics. Unless someone stopped it first. I looked at the evidence covering every surface of my home office. Boxes of documents, drives full of data, a network of terminated employees all holding pieces of the puzzle. Grayson Bell thought he'd silenced us with pink slips and severance packages. He thought we'd slink away, defeated and demoralized. He thought wrong. Because while he was planning his $5 billion score, we were building something else, a case, a reckoning, A chance to show the world what really happened when you gave a silver-spoon sociopath the keys to a kingdom. I picked up a red marker and circled a date on my calendar. The IPO filing deadline. 6 weeks away. That was our timeline. 6 weeks to compile the evidence, build the case, and drop it like a bomb on Grayson Bell's carefully constructed empire. The golden boy was about to learn that some things couldn't be fixed with charm and connections. Some sins couldn't be buried with termination letters, and some compliance officers didn't know how to stay quiet, even after you'd taken everything from them. Especially after you'd taken everything from them. The clause that would destroy Grayson Bell was hidden in plain sight, buried on page 47 of a policy manual no one had read in years. I found it at 321 of fine, eyes burning from staring at screen after screen of corporate documentation, searching for the weapon I knew had to exist. Section 4.2.1 of the Third-Party Vendor Compliance Policy, implemented January 2019, signed by Robert Harson himself. All third-party vendors must undergo legal origin verification every 6 months, no exceptions, no overrides. This clause remains in effect until formally amended by board resolution. I read it 3 times, heart accelerating with each pass. This wasn't just policy, it was corporate law within Harson Dynamics. Violating it wasn't just bad practice. It was grounds for immediate termination and potential criminal charges for fiduciary breach. I searched the board minutes for the past 5 years. No amendment, no revision, no mention of the clause at all. It had been forgotten, buried under layers of new initiatives and restructuring. But forgetting didn't make it void. Ignorance didn't excuse violation. And Grayson Bell had violated it hundreds of times. My phone buzzed. Message from David Kim. Found something huge. Meet tomorrow at the place we discussed. Bring everything on vendor verification. The place was a diner 30 miles outside the city, chosen for its terrible coffee and complete lack of Harson employees. I arrived at 6 a.m. to find David already there, laptop open, surrounded by printed spreadsheets. Remember how I grabbed server logs before they locked me out? He said without preamble. I found the audit trail for vendor creation. Every shell company, every fake vendor, they all bypassed the verification queue. Someone manually overrode the system requirement. Who has that access? 3 people, the CFO, the head of IT, and the CEO. He turned his laptop toward me. Look at the override logs. Every single one has the same digital signature. Grayson Bell, his authorization on every violation, his digital fingerprints on hundreds of instances of policy breach. He hadn't just allowed it to happen, he'd personally facilitated it. There's more, David continued. I traced the verification clause back to its origin. Robert Harson implemented it after a vendor fraud case in 2018. Small potatoes compared to this, but it spooked him. He wanted ironclad protection. And his hand-picked successor systematically dismantled that protection, while keeping the policy technically in place. That's the beautiful part, he never removed the requirement. He just ignored it, which means every payment to an unverified vendor is a violation. Every approval is documented breach of fiduciary duty. I pulled out my phone, calculating. At average transaction sizes, with the frequency we've documented, over 3,000 individual violations, David finished, each one a potential felony charge for corporate fraud. I thought about the shell companies, their generic names and phantom addresses, Next-Gen Solutions, registered to a strip mall mailbox, Infinity Partners, sharing an address with a Chinese restaurant, Meridian Logistics, operating from a virtual office that existed only on paper. None of them would pass even basic verification, let alone the comprehensive review the policy required. The Cyprus connection, I said suddenly. Margaret found it 18 months ago. That's why they had to silence her. She discovered that the shell companies were routing through Cyprus banks. The verification process would have exposed the whole network. David pulled up another document. I found her original report. She'd identified 7 vendors with Cyprus banking relationships, all flagged for verification, all overridden by Grayson personally. 7 companies. I cross-referenced with my records. Those same 7 had processed over $80 million in payments. $80 million that should have been stopped by a simple policy check. He must have known about the clause, I mused. Why keep violating something that could destroy him? Arrogance, David suggested. Or maybe he thought no one would ever check. The policy manual is 900 pages. Who reads every clause? Compliance officers read every clause. That's what we did. What we were paid for. What made us inconvenient enough to purge. I opened my laptop and began mapping the connections. 3 shell companies at first, all registered within days of each other. The addresses were the revelation, not just fake, but strategically fake. Delaware corporations with Nevada banking and overseas transfers. A structure designed to maximize confusion and minimize oversight. Wait, I said, staring at the registration documents. Look at the dates. Every shell company was created just after a board meeting. Specifically, just after board meetings where vendor oversight was discussed. David checked his records. You're right. February board meeting mentions vendor controls. March 1st, 2 new shells appear. April board discusses audit procedures. May 1st, 3 more shells. He was reacting to oversight by creating more ways to avoid it. Every time the board expressed concern, he built new pipelines for theft. The pattern was clear now. Grayson would attend board meetings, hear concerns about financial controls, then immediately create new vehicles to circumvent those controls, all while assuring the board that their concerns were being addressed. I found myself thinking about the employees who'd processed these payments, accounts payable clerks following orders, believing the approvals were legitimate. How many of them had felt something was wrong but stayed quiet, afraid for their jobs? How many had been terminated when they asked too many questions? The verification clause isn't just about the vendors. I realized it's about the verification process itself. Look, it requires documentation of beneficial ownership, banking relationships, business licenses. Every fake company would have left a trail of forged documents. Forged documents are federal crimes, David said quietly. Wire fraud if they cross state lines. Bank fraud if they involved false statements to financial institutions. We sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. This wasn't just corporate theft anymore. This was a massive criminal conspiracy, documented in excruciating detail by the very systems designed to prevent it. My phone rang. Susan Martinez, voice tight with excitement. Lauren, I found it. The board resolution you asked about. There was an attempt to amend the vendor policy in September 2023. What happened? It failed. 3 board members voted against it, citing the need for strong controls. The minutes specifically state that Section 4.2.1 remains in full effect. Grayson was at that meeting. He knew the clause was still active. Knowledge, intent, action, the 3 elements of criminal fraud, all documented in corporate records. Grayson hadn't just stumbled into crime, he'd walked in with his eyes open, confident that his name and connections would protect him. I thought about Ryan Bell, the cousin whose name appeared on so many registrations. Had he known what he was signing up for, or had Grayson convinced him it was just creative accounting, just bending rules that didn't matter anyway? The server logs David had saved showed a disturbing detail. 3 days before my termination, someone had accessed the vendor policy manual. They'd viewed Section 4.2.1 for exactly 47 seconds. Then they'd accessed the HR system and begun preparing termination letters. They knew. They'd always known. And when they realized someone else knew, they'd acted swiftly to silence the threat. But they'd missed something crucial. The clause didn't just require verification. It required documentation of the verification process. Every override, every exception, every decision to bypass controls had to be recorded. And in their arrogance, they'd recorded everything. We need to move fast, I said. Once they realize we have this, they'll try to destroy evidence, claim system errors, manufacture explanations. Already happening, David said, showing me an internal email he'd received from a friend still inside. Emergency IT maintenance scheduled for this weekend. Full server replacement. All logs to be upgraded to a new system. Upgraded, destroyed, erased, the digital equivalent of a paper shredder working overtime. But they were too late. We had the evidence. We had the clause. We had the proof of systematic, intentional violation of corporate policy in service of massive fraud. I looked at David across the table, seeing my own determination reflected in his eyes. One clause, that's all it took. One forgotten requirement that they couldn't be bothered to formally remove. "Pride goeth before a fall," he quoted, "and a haughty spirit before destruction." I completed, "Grayson Bell's about to learn that some rules can't be ignored, no matter who your daddy is." We packed up our evidence, prepared to take the next step. The clause was our smoking gun. But it was just the beginning. Now we needed to build the case that would bring down an empire built on lies, theft, and the arrogant assumption that rules didn't apply to golden boys with Harvard MBAs. Section 482.1. 47 words that would cost Grayson Bell everything. The summons came at 4:45 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after my termination. Not to my home, they were smarter than that. Instead, I received a call from my lawyer informing me that Harson Dynamics had requested an informal meeting to discuss my post-employment obligations. I knew what this was. They'd discovered something was missing. Some piece of evidence they needed to destroy. Now they wanted to fish, to see what I knew, what I had, what threat I posed to their $5 billion fantasy. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning at Harson's headquarters. Neutral ground would have been too fair. They wanted me on their territory, surrounded by their power, reminded of what they'd taken from me. I arrived at 9:58 a.m., wearing my best suit, the one I'd saved for board presentations. Security made me wait, a petty power play that told me everything about the meeting's true purpose. When they finally escorted me up, it wasn't to a conference room but to the executive floor, the inner sanctum where decisions were made and lives were destroyed. The room held 3 people: Grayson Bell himself, the head of HR, and a lawyer I didn't recognize. No Derek Morse interesting. They wanted to keep their new puppet compliance officer clean. Grayson looked exactly as he did in his publicity photos. Polished, confident, untouchable. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't offer his hand, didn't even pretend this was civilized. "Ms. Whitfield," he began, voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Thank you for coming. We need to discuss some concerns about proprietary information." I sat without being invited. What concerns would those be? The lawyer slid a paper across the table. "Our IT department has identified unusual access patterns in the weeks before your termination. Downloads of sensitive financial data, copies of internal communications, activities that violate your confidentiality agreement." I glanced at the paper without touching it. They'd tracked some of my research, but not all. Good to know. "I was doing my job," I said simply. "Compliance officers need access to financial data. That's rather the point." "Your job ended at 11:57 p.m. on September 3rd, Grayson interjected, speaking for the first time since his greeting. "Any access after that time constitutes theft of proprietary information." I smiled. "Actually, my obligations as a licensed compliance professional don't end with employment. I have a legal duty to report suspected financial irregularities to appropriate authorities. That duty supersedes any corporate NDA." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The HR head shifted uncomfortably. The lawyer's poker face cracked slightly. But Grayson just studied me like a specimen under glass. "What irregularities?" he asked, voice dangerously quiet. "The ones detailed in Report HD 2024-317. The vendor anomalies I flagged, the ones that seem to have triggered my sudden termination." "You were terminated as part of a broader restructuring. 17 people in 2 weeks, all from compliance, audit, or IT security. That's not restructuring. That's a purge." Silence stretched between us. I could see Grayson calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I could prove, how much damage I could do. Finally, he leaned back. "What do you want?" "Lauren." There it was. The negotiation. The attempt to buy my silence. I want to understand why Report HD 2024-317 was so threatening that it required my immediate termination. That report contained errors. Which errors? Specifically, I'd be happy to review them, correct any mistakes. After all, accuracy is paramount in compliance work. The lawyer touched Grayson's arm, a warning, but the CEO's ego wouldn't let him back down. Your report made insinuations about vendor relationships without full understanding of our strategic partnerships. Your narrow perspective failed to grasp the bigger picture. The bigger picture being shell companies registered to strip mall addresses, payments to entities with no web presence, no employees, no actual services rendered. You don't understand modern business structures. I understand Section 42.1 of the Vendor Compliance Policy. Do you? The words landed like a slap. Grayson went very still. The lawyer's face drained of color. Even the HR head, who probably didn't know the details, sensed the sudden danger. I understand, I continued, voice steady, that every vendor requires origin verification every 6 months. No exceptions, no overrides. I understand that this policy has never been formally amended, and I understand that systematic violation of this policy constitutes fiduciary breach. Grayson found his voice. That's an outdated policy from the previous administration. Signed by Robert Harson, never revoked, still binding. I leaned forward. How many vendors have you personally approved without verification? Grayson, dozens, hundreds. This meeting is over, the lawyer announced, standing abruptly. But I wasn't done. You should have audited the Cyprus transfers. Now it's on record that you didn't. Grayson's composure finally cracked. Just for a second, I saw fear flash across his face. Cyprus. He knew I knew about Cyprus. Get out, he said quietly. I stood, gathering my things with deliberate calm. Understood, I said, echoing the same word I'd used when they fired me. But this time, it carried a different weight, a promise, a threat. The HR head followed me to the elevator. Lauren, she said quietly when we were alone, whatever you think you're doing. My duty, I interrupted. The same duty I've always done, just without the corporate letterhead. They'll destroy you. You know that, right? They have resources you can't imagine. I thought about the 17 terminated employees working together in secret, the evidence we'd compiled, the SEC contact waiting for my call, the journalist who'd started asking questions about Harson's miraculous financial turnaround. Maybe, I admitted, but they should have thought of that before they fired me, before they fired all of us. The elevator opened. As I stepped in, the HR head said one last thing. The Cyprus accounts. Grayson doesn't know you know about those. Be careful. The doors closed before I could respond, but her warning echoed as I descended. She'd just confirmed what I suspected. The Cyprus connection was the heart of it all, the thing they'd kill to protect. Outside, I sat in my car for 10 minutes, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. They'd tried to intimidate me, then bribe me, then threaten me. Classic progression. But they'd also revealed their weakness. They didn't know how much evidence we'd gathered. They were scared, reactive, making mistakes. My phone buzzed. Text from David. They're accelerating the server replacement, moving it to tonight instead of this weekend. Whatever you said spooked them. I smiled grimly. Good. Panicked people made sloppy errors. And Grayson Bell, for all his polish, was definitely panicked. Another text. This from Susan Martinez. Just got a call offering me double severance if I sign an enhanced NDA. They're trying to buy everyone's silence. The full court press had begun. They'd identified us as threats, and were moving to neutralize us with the only tool they understood: money. But they'd missed the crucial point. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice, about truth, about showing the world what happened when corporations put criminals in charge. I started my car and drove home, mind already working on next steps. The meeting had been meant to scare me into submission. Instead, it had confirmed everything I suspected. They were guilty, they were terrified, and they were about to make a fatal mistake. Because in their arrogance, They'd revealed their timeline. The server replacement tonight meant we had less than 8 hours to execute our plan. 8 hours to finalize evidence packages, contact authorities, and ensure that their digital shredding would be too little, too late. I pulled into my driveway and saw 2 unfamiliar cars parked across the street. Watchers. They were having me followed now, tracking my movements, trying to predict my next move. Let them watch. Let them follow. Let them see me living my normal life, while 17 of their former employees worked in the shadows to bring down their house of cards. The meeting had accomplished one thing. It had shown me the face of my enemy, Grayson Bell, with his practiced smile and designer suit, thinking he could intimidate a middle-aged compliance officer into silence. He'd learned nothing from firing me, nothing from the pattern of his crimes, nothing from the history of every corporate criminal who thought they were too smart to get caught. But he was about to learn they all were. Understood, I whispered to myself, pulling out my phone to set the final plan in motion. In 8 hours, Grayson Bell would understand too. He'd understand what happened when you fired someone who knew where all the bodies were buried and had kept receipts for every single grave. The Whisper network activated at 6 p.m. sharp. 17 former employees, scattered across the city, began executing a coordinated plan we'd rehearsed for weeks. We called ourselves Clause Zero, a reminder of the forgotten rule that had started it all. My phone buzzed with updates as each member confirmed their position. David Kim was at a FedEx office downtown, preparing to overnight packages to the SEC, FBI, and IRS. Susan Martinez sat in her car outside the offices of the Wall Street Journal, waiting to hand-deliver evidence to a financial reporter who'd been tracking Harson's suspicious growth. Bradley Thompson was uploading gigabytes of data to multiple secure cloud servers, ensuring our evidence would survive any attempt at destruction. The others had similar tasks, contacting board members who'd been kept in the dark, reaching out to institutional investors who deserved to know their money was at risk, alerting industry watchdogs who'd been asking questions about Harson's miraculous margins. We moved like a well-oiled machine, each person playing their part. The terminated employees Grayson Bell had thrown away like trash, now working together with the precision of a military operation. My role was perhaps the most crucial. At 6:30 p.m., I placed a call to Jennifer Walsh, my law school roommate who now worked in the SEC's Division of Enforcement. She'd been expecting my call for days, ever since I'd sent her an encrypted message saying I had information about a potential securities fraud. "Lauren," she answered on the first ring, "tell me you have what you promised. $5 billion in fraudulent valuation ahead of an IPO, systematic vendor fraud, money laundering through Cyprus, documentation of everything, including CEO involvement." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. "How solid is the evidence?" "Server logs, emails, bank records, forged documents, and here's the kicker, they're destroying evidence as we speak. Emergency server replacement happening tonight at Harson headquarters." Tonight they're spooked. They know we're on to them. Tried to intimidate me this morning, then started offering hush money to other terminated employees. Classic panic behavior. Jennifer was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear her calculating. "If they're destroying evidence tonight, we need to move immediately. Can you get me something concrete in the next hour? Something that shows imminent risk to investors." I smiled. "Check your secure email. I just sent you a preview package. 40 pages of the most damning evidence, including CEO authorization of unverified vendor payments in direct violation of corporate policy." Keys clicked in the background as she accessed the files. Then silence. Then a low whistle. "Jesus, Lauren, this is comprehensive." "That's just the appetizer. The full meal is 800 pages of documented fraud, cross-referenced and verified, bank records showing money moving to shell companies, registration documents with forged signatures, a paper trail that leads directly to Grayson Bell's digital authorization. The Cyprus accounts. Can you prove beneficial ownership? Ryan Bell, the CEO's cousin. His name is buried in the documentation, but it's there. 3 shell companies routing money through Cyprus banks, all traceable to him. More typing. I could picture Jennifer in her office, probably working late as always, surrounded by monitors and coffee cups. She'd been fighting corporate crime for 15 years, but even she sounded shocked by what she was seeing. Lauren, this is massive. If half of what you're showing me is true, it's all true. 17 former employees can verify different pieces. We were all terminated for getting too close to the truth. I need to loop in my supervisor. Can you hold? I held, standing at my window watching the unmarked car still parked across the street. My watchers were getting sloppy. Probably hired private investigators who thought they were following a cheating spouse, not someone about to blow up a $5 billion fraud. Jennifer came back on the line, voice charged with new urgency. We're mobilizing a team. FBI Financial Crimes Unit is being notified. We need you to come in tonight. Bring everything. Can you get to our office by 8? I'll be there. Lauren, be careful. If they're this panicked, they might do something desperate. I thought about the car outside, the veiled threats in the morning meeting, the way Grayson's mask had slipped when I mentioned Cyprus. I know, that's why we're moving tonight. 17 witnesses are harder to silence than one. After hanging up, I sent a coded message to the Clause 0 network. Green light, execute all packages. The responses came quickly, evidence dispersing across the country like seeds in the wind. Media contacts confirmed, board members reached, investors alerted, a coordinated strike that would hit from every angle simultaneously. My phone rang. Margaret Huang, my predecessor, calling from wherever she was hiding. I heard through the network, she said without preamble. You found it. The thing they fired me for trying to expose. We found it all. Margaret, Cyprus, the shells, the cousin, everything. It's over for them. Is it? Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd fought this battle and lost. They have money, lawyers, connections. They'll claim it's all misunderstanding, accounting errors, disgruntled employees seeking revenge. Not this time. We have their own systems documenting the fraud, their own emails discussing it, Grayson's personal authorization on every illegal transaction. The verification clause you found that too. Section 482.1, never amended, never revoked, 3,000 violations, each one signed by the CEO. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, quietly, thank you for finishing what I started, for being braver than I was. You were brave, Margaret. You lit the match. We're just finishing the fire. After we hung up, I gathered my evidence boxes, 3 copies of everything, one for the SEC, one for the FBI, one hidden in a safety deposit box, the physical documents they couldn't delete, couldn't deny, couldn't make disappear with a server upgrade. As I loaded my car, I noticed the watchers scrambling, one talking urgently on his phone, the other starting his engine. They'd figured out something was happening, but it was too late to stop it. I drove toward the SEC office, taking a deliberately circuitous route. Let them follow. Let them report back to Grayson that I was meeting with federal authorities. Let him sweat in his corner office, wondering how much time he had left. My phone lit up with notifications. The Wall Street Journal reporter confirming receipt of documents, a board member expressing shock at what he'd been shown, an institutional investor demanding an emergency audit, the dominoes falling exactly as we'd planned. But the best message came from someone still inside Harson, a friend in IT who'd managed to avoid the purge. They're in full panic mode. Grayson called an emergency meeting, legal department working overtime. They know something big is coming. Good. Let them scramble. Let them try to construct a defense against 17 coordinated voices speaking truth to power. Let them discover what happened when you created enemies with nothing left to lose. As I pulled into the federal building parking garage, I thought about the journey from that midnight termination email to this moment. They'd tried to bury me quietly, just another middle-aged compliance officer who'd outlived her usefulness. Instead, they'd created their own worst nightmare. The security guard checked my ID and waved me through. Somewhere in the building above, Jennifer Walsh and her team were preparing to take down one of the biggest corporate frauds in recent history, all because Grayson Bell couldn't be bothered to follow a simple verification process. I grabbed the first box of evidence and headed for the elevator. In a few hours, the news would break. The SEC would freeze assets, the FBI would execute warrants, the House of Cards would collapse, and everyone would wonder how it had stayed standing so long. But I knew it stayed standing because people like me were supposed to stay quiet. We were supposed to take our severance and slink away. We were supposed to be too scared, too tired, too beaten down to fight back. They'd counted on our silence. They'd bet $5 billion on it. They'd lost that bet. As the elevator rose toward justice, I smiled. Somewhere across the city, 16 other members of Clause Zero were delivering their own killing blows, a whisper network that had become a roar. Started by executives who'd forgotten that compliance officers never really stopped doing their jobs. We just sometimes have to do them without a corporate email address. The court filing dropped at 9 a.m. Eastern on a Wednesday morning, timed perfectly to hit before market open. SEC v. Harson Dynamics, Inc., Grayson Bell, and Ryan Bell, a civil complaint seeking immediate injunctive relief and asset freeze based on systematic securities fraud, wire fraud, and violation of fiduciary duties. I sat in my lawyer's office, watching the financial news channels explode with breaking alerts. My attorney, Patricia Reeves, had taken the case pro bono after reviewing the evidence, calling it the cleanest dirty fraud case she'd seen in 30 years of practice. The FBI raid should be happening right about now, she said, checking her phone. My contact says they're executing warrants at Harson headquarters, Grayson's home, and 3 other locations. I thought about Grayson in his corner office, probably in the middle of a morning meeting when federal agents walked in. Did he maintain that polished composure when they presented the warrant? Did he finally understand that his name and connections couldn't save him? The complaint was a masterpiece of legal writing, outlining the fraud in devastating detail. Jennifer Walsh and her team had worked through the night, transforming our evidence into 97 pages of accusations that read like a corporate thriller. The shell companies were dissected with surgical precision. Next-Gen Solutions Incorporated in Delaware by Ryan Bell using a forged attorney signature, funded through Harson accounts, existed only to receive payments for non-existent services. Infinity Partners registered to a virtual office, billing for consulting work that no employee could verify, moving money through 3 countries before it disappeared. Meridian Logistics, the boldest fraud, charging for supply chain optimization while Harson's actual logistics costs increased. But the heart of the complaint was Section 4.2.1, 20 pages dedicated to the vendor verification requirement, its purpose, its binding nature, and the 3,000 documented violations, each violation listed with date, amount, and Grayson Bell's digital authorization. They're calling it the Clause Zero scandal already, Patricia noted, scrolling through her tablet. Your network's name is sticking. The financial news anchors were struggling to explain the complexity. One described it as a CEO who allegedly treated his company like a personal ATM, hidden behind a maze of shell companies. Another called it the consequence of nepotism meets greed meets stupidity. But they all focused on the number $5.1 billion, the proposed IPO valuation based on fraudulent financials, the money that retail investors would have lost if we hadn't acted. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Reporters wanting comments, former colleagues expressing shock, even a few cryptic threats from unknown numbers. Patricia had advised me to stay quiet for now, let the legal process play out. But others in Clause Zero were talking. David Kim appeared on CNBC, calmly explaining the technical aspects of how the fraud was concealed. They thought deleting server logs would hide their tracks, he said. They didn't realize we'd already preserved everything. Susan Martinez gave an interview to the Financial Times, detailing the systematic dismantling of internal controls. Every safeguard that might have caught this fraud was deliberately weakened or removed. This wasn't negligence, it was architecture. The market reaction was swift and brutal. Harson Dynamics stock halted after dropping 47% in pre-market trading. When it resumed, it fell another 30%. Billions in market value evaporated as investors fled. Patricia's phone rang. She listened, nodded, then hung up with a grim smile. Grayson's been arrested. Perp walk happening now if you want to watch. She turned on a different channel, and there he was, Grayson Bell, the Golden Boy CEO, being led out of Harson headquarters in handcuffs. His perfect suit wrinkled, his perfect hair mussed, his perfect image shattered. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. But what struck me most was his expression. Not shocked or angry or defiant, just empty, like a machine that had been unplugged. The magnitude of his downfall seemed to have short-circuited something fundamental. Ryan Bell was arrested at JFK, Patricia added, trying to board a flight to Switzerland, had 4 passports and $2 million in bearer bonds in his luggage. The cousin, the bagman, the one whose name was buried in Cyprus documentation, running for the exits while his cousin faced the cameras. The news coverage shifted to Harson headquarters, where employees were streaming out, some crying, most just bewildered. These were good people who'd come to work expecting a normal day, only to find FBI agents seizing computers and their company imploding. That's the real tragedy, I said quietly. 12,000 employees who did nothing wrong, about to lose their jobs because one man thought he was above the law. The court will appoint a receiver, Patricia assured me. Try to salvage what's left. Maybe find a buyer. Some jobs will be saved. But we both knew it wouldn't be enough. The damage was too deep. The fraud too systemic. Harson Dynamics, a company that had survived 2 world wars and countless recessions, wouldn't survive Grayson Bell. My phone rang. Jennifer Walsh from the SEC. Lauren, I wanted you to be the first to know. We're adding criminal charges. The evidence you provided shows clear intent to defraud investors ahead of the IPO. The U.S. Attorney is taking this to a grand jury. Criminal charges, not just civil penalties and fines, but potential prison time, the kind of consequences that couldn't be fixed with expensive lawyers and PR firms. There's more, Jennifer continued. We're finding evidence of similar schemes at 2 other companies where Grayson worked before Harson. Your case broke open a pattern going back years. A serial fraudster, someone who'd perfected his craft at smaller companies before attempting his masterpiece at Harson. How many other Margaret Huangs and Lauren Whitfields had he silenced along the way? The news switched to file footage of Robert Harson, the company founder, at his retirement ceremony 2 years ago, handing the reins to Grayson with obvious pride, talking about fresh blood and new perspectives. The old man had built something real, something valuable, and handed it to someone who saw it only as a vehicle for theft. He's given a statement, Patricia said, reading from her phone. Robert Harson. I am shocked and heartbroken by these allegations. I trusted Grayson Bell with my life's work, and he betrayed that trust. I apologize to all stakeholders and pledge my full cooperation with authorities. Too little, too late. The man who'd implemented Section 4.2.1 to protect his company had handpicked the very person who would violate it thousands of times. Another breaking alert. SEC announces whistleblower awards in Harson Dynamics case. The government would pay percentage rewards to those who'd provided crucial evidence, blood money, some might call it, justice money. I preferred. Patricia turned to me. You realize you'll be the star witness when this goes to trial. Grayson's lawyers will try to destroy you on the stand. I thought about that morning meeting in the executive conference room, Grayson's casual arrogance, his certainty that I could be intimidated or bought, the way he'd said, "You don't understand modern business structures," when I'd confronted him about the shell companies. Let them try, I said. I've got 17 corroborating witnesses and 800 pages of documentation. Plus, I've already lost everything they could take from me. What's left to destroy? The coverage continued throughout the day. Analysis of how the fraud worked, profiles of the perpetrators, speculation about criminal sentences. But my favorite segment was a brief interview with Derek Morse, the man who'd helped bury my reports and been rewarded with my job. He looked terrified, stammering about just following orders and had no idea about any fraud. The reporter pressed him on the delayed reports, the mysterious edits, his promotion to chief compliance officer after the purge. By the end, Derek was practically begging to be believed, claiming he was a victim too. "Think they'll charge him?" Patricia asked. "Depends what they find in his emails, but at minimum, he'll never work in compliance again. Hard to get hired when your claim to fame is enabling the biggest corporate fraud in a decade." As afternoon turned to evening, the full scope became clear. Congressional hearings announced, SEC rule changes proposed, business schools preparing case studies. The Clause Zero scandal would ripple through corporate America for years. But for me, watching from my lawyer's office, the victory felt hollow. Yes, we'd stopped the fraud. Yes, we'd protected future investors. Yes, we'd brought down the criminals who'd destroyed so many careers. But Harson Dynamics was still dying. Good people were still losing their livelihoods. A century-old company was still reduced to a cautionary tale. "You did the right thing," Patricia said, reading my expression. "Sometimes the right thing hurts." I nodded, gathering my things to leave. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more statements, more preparation for the trial ahead. The work of justice was just beginning. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed one last time, a message from Margaret Huang. "Watching the news. Thank you for finishing what I couldn't. The truth matters, even when it hurts." The truth matters. Such a simple concept, yet one that Grayson Bell had never understood. He'd built an empire on lies and thought it would last forever. Instead, it had lasted exactly as long as it took for one compliance officer to say, enough. $5.1 billion in fraud, 3,000 violations of a single clause, 17 terminated employees who refused to stay silent, and one CEO who thought he was too big to fail, learning the hardest way possible that no one ever is. The filing was done, the fraud was exposed, the justice system was in motion. And I was unemployed, exhausted, and oddly at peace. Because sometimes doing the right thing means losing everything except your integrity. And as I drove home past the news vans and protesters gathering outside Harson headquarters, I realized that was the one thing Grayson Bell had never been able to take from me. The one thing that, in the end, had taken everything from him. The discovery phase began 6 months after the initial filing, and that's when we learned the true scope of Grayson Bell's arrogance. The court had ordered Harson Dynamics to produce all relevant documents, and what emerged from their servers was a masterclass in corporate criminality. I sat in a conference room at the federal building, surrounded by bankers' boxes and FBI forensic accountants, watching as they unpacked years of deceit. Each document told a story of greed unchecked, of systems deliberately corrupted, of a CEO who believed his own lies. "This is extraordinary," Agent Sarah Coleman said, holding up a printed email chain. "He documented everything, every decision, every override, every criminal act. It's all here in writing." The email she held was particularly damning, dated 18 months ago, from Grayson to Derek Morse. "Override the vendor verification for Meridian. I don't care what the policy says. We need this deal closed before the quarterly earnings call." Derek's response was equally incriminating. "Understood. I'll handle Lauren if she asks questions." Lauren. Me. They'd been planning to handle me for over a year before they finally pulled the trigger. Jennifer Walsh from the SEC was leading the review, her team methodically cataloging evidence for both civil and criminal proceedings. "Look at this," she said, sliding a document across the table. Board presentation from 2 years ago. Grayson specifically mentions the vendor verification requirement and promises the board it's being followed. Lies to the board, securities fraud, wire fraud. The charges were multiplying like cancer cells. But the most shocking discovery came from an encrypted folder on Grayson's personal drive, cracked open by the FBI's cyber team. Inside were recordings, audio files of phone conversations he'd secretly made, apparently thinking they'd protect him if his conspirators ever turned. We listened to one in stunned silence. Grayson's voice, talking to his cousin Ryan. The Cyprus accounts are perfect. By the time anyone traces the money, it's been through 6 countries. Even if they catch us, they'll never recover the funds. Ryan's response, "What about that compliance woman? She's been sniffing around the vendor files." "I'll handle her when the time comes. One thing I learned at McKinsey, it's easier to fire problems than solve them." Agent Coleman paused the recording. He just confessed to conspiracy, money laundering, and wrongful termination, on tape, that he made himself ego, Jennifer said simply. He thought he was creating insurance. Instead, he created evidence. The paper trail revealed the full network. Not just 3 shell companies, but 47. Not just Cyprus, but Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Singapore. A global web of fraud that had drained Harson Dynamics of nearly $500 million over 3 years. "Here's what kills me," I said, studying a spreadsheet of phantom transactions. "The company was profitable. They didn't need to steal. This was pure greed." "It's never about need with these types," Agent Coleman replied. "It's about winning, about proving they're smarter than everyone else." As we worked through the evidence, my phone buzzed with updates from the Clause Zero network. David Kim had found evidence of Grayson backdating contracts to hide losses. Susan Martinez had discovered he'd been selling company secrets to competitors through the shell companies. Bradley Thompson had traced payments that looked suspiciously like bribes to regulatory officials. Each revelation was another nail in Grayson's coffin, but also another wound to Harson Dynamics. The company I'd loved, had given 12 years to, was revealing itself to be more thoroughly corrupted than any of us had imagined. Patricia Reeves arrived at 2 p.m. with news from the criminal case. Grand jury returned a 43-count indictment. Grayson's looking at potential life in prison if convicted on all counts. Ryan Bell got 27 counts. Derek Morse just flipped he's cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. Derek Morse, the man who'd stolen my job, who'd helped bury my reports, who'd enabled the entire scheme, now trying to save himself by selling out his masters. "What's he saying?" Jennifer asked. "Everything," Patricia smiled grimly. "Names, dates, amounts. He kept his own records. Apparently, never trusted Grayson completely." There was something poetic about it. The conspirators turning on each other, each trying to minimize their own culpability. Honor among thieves was a myth, especially when the thieves wore Armani. The most powerful piece of evidence came late in the day, buried in server backups. The FBI found the original vendor files before Derek's edits, before the cover-up, before the lies, my reports, intact and damning, with timestamps proving they'd been altered after submission. "This is your vindication," Jennifer said, showing me the metadata. "Every concern you raised, every red flag you identified, you were right about all of it." I stared at my old reports, remembering the late nights spent analyzing data, the careful construction of each argument, the professional obligation that had driven me to speak truth to power. They'd tried to bury my work. Instead, they'd preserved it in amber, waiting for justice to find it. "There's something else," Agent Coleman said, pulling up a new file. "We found communications between Grayson and several board members. It appears some of them knew about the fraud." My heart sank. How deep did this go? How many people had chosen to look away while Grayson pillaged the company? The communications were carefully worded, full of plausible deniability, but the pattern was clear. Certain board members had been asking fewer questions, pushing for less oversight, voting against stronger controls. Whether actively complicit or willfully ignorant, they'd enabled the crime. "We're going to need you to testify about the board dynamics," Jennifer said. "Who pushed for accountability? Who resisted? Who seemed to know more than they let on?" I nodded, though the prospect made me sick. Testifying against Grayson was one thing he was clearly guilty, but implicating board members, some of whom I'd respected, felt like another betrayal of the company I'd loved. As the day wore on, the evidence mountain grew higher. Forged contracts, falsified performance metrics, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, a cancer that had metastasized through every department Grayson could influence. At 5 p.m., Patricia pulled me aside. "I need to warn you about something. Grayson's legal team is going to come after you hard. They're already floating theories that you orchestrated this whole thing as revenge for being fired. That's absurd. The evidence speaks for itself." "Evidence can be twisted. They'll claim you had access to systems, knowledge of procedures, motive for revenge. They'll try to make you the villain." I thought about the midnight termination, the empty boxes, the security escort. Yes, I had motive for revenge, but my revenge had been truth, not fraud. "Let them try," I said. "I've got 17 witnesses who were also fired. Are they claiming we all conspired together?" "Actually," Patricia showed me a legal filing. "That's exactly what they're claiming. They're calling Clause 0 a criminal conspiracy aimed at destroying Harson Dynamics for profit." The audacity was breathtaking. The actual criminals were accusing their victims of conspiracy, but that was Grayson's pattern attack when cornered: deflect when guilty, destroy when threatened. As we packed up for the day, Jennifer made a prediction. "This is going to be the most watched corporate fraud trial in years. The evidence is overwhelming, the characters are compelling, and the stakes are enormous." "I just wanted to do my job," I said quietly. "Review vendors, ensure compliance, protect the company. How did it come to this?" "Because someone thought the rules didn't apply to him," Agent Coleman replied. "And because you were brave enough to prove him wrong." That night, I went home to more bankers' boxes, more evidence to review, more preparation for the trial ahead. The local news was running a segment on former Harson employees struggling to find work. The company's taint was spreading, making everyone associated with it radioactive. My phone rang. Margaret Huang, calling from wherever she was rebuilding her life. "I saw the Discovery News," she said. 47 shell companies. I only found 7. How did I miss so much?" "You didn't miss it. You found what they wanted you to find. The rest was better hidden, deeper buried. It took 17 of us to uncover it all." "Do you think he'll be convicted?" I thought about the recordings, the emails, the falsified documents, the sheer weight of evidence that grew heavier each day. "Yes," I said. "He documented his own crimes, recorded his own confessions, preserved his own guilt. He'll be convicted because he couldn't imagine being caught." After we hung up, I returned to the evidence boxes. Somewhere in these documents was the full story of how one man's greed had destroyed a century-old company. My job now was to help the court understand that story, to speak for the employees who'd lost everything, to ensure that justice was more than just a word. The discovery phase would continue for weeks. More evidence would surface, more conspirators would flip, more damage would be revealed. But the core truth was already clear. Grayson Bell had stolen more than money. He'd stolen trust, futures, the very soul of a company. And while we could never undo that theft, we could at least ensure he paid the price. Document by document, email by email, lie by lie. Until the Golden Boy CEO understood what 47 shell companies' worth of justice looked like. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never seen media coverage quite like this. Every major news outlet had sent their top financial reporters. Cable news vans lined the street. Social media influencers live-streamed from the courthouse steps. The United States Vice. Grayson Bell had become the trial of the decade. I arrived at 7:15 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings were scheduled to begin. My testimony was set for day 3, but Patricia wanted me there from the start, observing, preparing, understanding the rhythm of the prosecution's case. The courtroom was already half full when we entered. I recognized several former Harson employees, including members of Clause 0. David Kim nodded from across the aisle. Susan Martinez gave me a tight smile. We were all here to watch justice unfold, to see if the system we'd trusted with our evidence would deliver. Then Grayson Bell entered. Prison had changed him. The Golden Boy CEO who'd commanded boardrooms was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed defendant in an ill-fitting suit. His perfect hair had thinned. His confident swagger had become a shuffle. But his eyes still held that dangerous arrogance, that certainty that he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He sat at the defense table with his team of lawyers, 7 of them, each probably billing more per hour than most Harsin employees had made in a month. They'd painted him as a victim of overzealous prosecution, a visionary brought down by disgruntled former employees. Judge Patricia Kowalski called the court to order at 9 a.m. sharp, a former prosecutor herself. She had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and suffering no fools. The defense had tried unsuccessfully to have her removed, claiming bias. That told me everything I needed to know about their chances. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, stood for his opening statement. He was younger than I'd expected, but his words carried the weight of thorough preparation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about betrayal. Betrayal of shareholders who trusted their investments to Harsin Dynamics. Betrayal of employees who gave their careers to build something meaningful. And most of all, betrayal by a CEO who saw his position not as a responsibility, but as a license to steal. He outlined the case methodically, the shell companies, the falsified documents, the systematic override of controls, and through it all, Section 4.2.1, the simple vendor verification requirement that Grayson had violated thousands of times. The defendant will claim this was aggressive business practice, creative accounting, misunderstandings blown out of proportion by bitter ex-employees. Rodriguez paused, making eye contact with each juror. But I will show you his own emails authorizing fraud. You will hear his own voice planning crimes. You will see with your own eyes how he turned a respected company into his personal piggy bank. The defense attorney, William Sterling, presented a different narrative. Grayson was an innovator who tried to modernize a failing company. The terminated employees were a cabal of resistance, fighting change, ultimately conspiring to destroy what they couldn't control. Ms. Whitfield and her co-conspirators call themselves Clause Zero, Sterling said, managing to make our name sound sinister. They coordinated their attacks, shared stolen confidential information, and launched a campaign designed to destroy Harsin Dynamics out of spite. I felt my jaw clench. Patricia put a calming hand on my arm. "Let him talk," she whispered. "The evidence will bury these lies." The first day was mostly procedural, but day 2 brought the forensic accountants. They presented the money trail in excruciating detail. Charts showing funds flowing from Harsin to shell companies, graphs documenting how each fictitious vendor invoice corresponded to Grayson's personal spending spikes, a map of international transfers that looked like a spider web of greed. "Can you tell us the total amount diverted through these schemes?" Rodriguez asked the lead accountant. $487 million over 3 years. Gasps from the gallery. Even I hadn't realized the final tally was that high. And where did this money go? Approximately 60% remains unaccounted for. Likely in offshore accounts we haven't yet identified. The rest was used for personal expenses, real estate, luxury vehicles, private jet travel, and what appeared to be bribes to secure additional business. The defense tried to muddy the waters, suggesting the accountants had misunderstood legitimate business expenses, but the numbers were too clear, the patterns too obvious. You could see the jury starting to understand the scope of the theft. Day 3. My day. I wore my best suit, the same one I'd worn to the termination meeting. Patricia said it would resonate with the jury, a visual reminder of my professional standing before Grayson destroyed it. "State your name for the record," Rodriguez began after I was sworn in. "Lauren Whitfield." "And what was your position at Harsin Dynamics?" "Chief Compliance Officer. Former Chief Compliance Officer." Rodriguez walked me through my background, my 12 years at Harsin, my responsibilities. He established me as a credible professional, not the vengeful conspirator the defense claimed. "Can you tell us about Report HD 2024-31C? I explained the routine vendor review, the anomalies I discovered, my recommendation for further investigation. Rodriguez displayed the report on screens for the jury, highlighting my specific concerns about shell companies and verification failures. And what happened after you submitted this report? I was terminated at 11:57 p.m. that same night, via email, no explanation, no discussion, just immediate termination. Had you ever received any negative performance reviews? No. My last review, 3 months earlier, rated me as exceeds expectations in all categories. Rodriguez then walked me through the discovery of Section 4.2.1, the vendor verification requirement. I explained its purpose, its binding nature, and how systematically it had been violated. Did you ever see anyone override this requirement? Yes. The system logs show CEO authorization on every override. The defendant's authorization. Yes. Grayson Bell personally approved every violation of the vendor verification policy. Sterling rose for cross-examination like a wolf approaching prey. He attacked my credibility, my motives, my actions after termination. Ms. Whitfield, isn't it true you accessed company systems after your termination? I had previously backed up files in the normal course of my work, which is standard practice for compliance officers maintaining evidence trails. You formed a group called Clause 0, correct? Former employees who'd been wrongfully terminated shared information about our experiences, yes, and coordinated your attacks on Harson Dynamics. We coordinated providing evidence of criminal activity to appropriate authorities. We reported crimes. Mr. Sterling, we didn't commit them. He pressed harder, trying to paint me as bitter, vindictive, orchestrating a conspiracy, but every attack ran into the wall of documented evidence. How could I have forged Grayson's digital signatures? How could I have created shell companies that predated my employment? How could I have falsified records I'd never had access to? Ms. Whitfield, Sterling said, frustration creeping into his voice. You expect this jury to believe that you and 16 other terminated employees just happened to uncover a massive fraud that no one else noticed. I met his gaze steadily. No, Mr. Sterling. Others noticed. Margaret Huang noticed and was fired for it. Internal auditors noticed and were reassigned. Board members asked questions and were told creative stories. People noticed. But Grayson Bell had the power to silence them, until he fired too many of us to keep quiet. Rodriguez's redirect was brief but powerful. He displayed an email from Grayson to Derek Morse. Dated a week before my termination, Whitfield is becoming a problem. Time to implement the solution we discussed. Ms. Whitfield, what solution do you think the defendant was referring to? My termination. They'd been planning it, waiting for an excuse. My report gave them one. As I left the stand, I passed Grayson at the defense table. For just a moment, our eyes met. I saw rage there, but also something else, fear. He was starting to understand that his stolen fortune couldn't buy his way out of this. The trial would continue for 3 more weeks. Ryan Bell would testify against his cousin in exchange for a lighter sentence. Derek Morse would detail every falsified document, every buried report, every criminal order he'd followed. The FBI would present the recordings Grayson had made, his own voice condemning him. But for me, the crucial moment had passed. I'd spoken my truth in open court, under oath, with the world watching. The compliance officer he'd tried to bury had risen to bury him instead. That night, the Clause 0 network gathered at a quiet bar near the courthouse. 17 former employees who'd risked everything to expose the truth. We didn't celebrate too many people had been hurt for that, but we acknowledged what we'd accomplished. Think he'll be convicted? Bradley Thompson asked. The evidence is overwhelming, David Kim replied. But more importantly, we've changed things. Companies will think twice before firing whistleblowers. Boards will take compliance seriously. Maybe some future Margaret Huang or Lauren Whitfield won't have to go through what we did. I raised my glass of wine. To Section 4.2.1, the clause they forgot to remove. To Clause 0, Susan Martinez countered. The employees they shouldn't have fired. We drank to that. 17 voices finally heard. 17 careers sacrificed for something bigger than ourselves. The trial would determine Grayson Bell's fate. but we'd already won the only victory that mattered. We'd proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the system could work, that truth could triumph over power, that a group of discarded employees could bring down a corrupt CEO and his $5 billion fraud. All because he'd been too arrogant to follow a simple verification process. All because we'd been too stubborn to stay silent. The verdict came down at 2:37 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, after 3 days of deliberation. I sat in the packed courtroom, Patricia Reeves on my left, David Kim on my right, surrounded by the other members of Clause Zero. We'd all taken time off from our new jobs, those of us who'd found them to be here for this moment. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Kowalski asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, a middle-aged woman who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial. Grayson Bell stood, his expensive legal team rising with him like a protective wall, but no amount of legal talent could shield him from what was coming. On count 1, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple went through the courtroom. Grayson's shoulders sagged slightly. On count 2, wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 3, money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through all 43 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word a hammer blow to the Golden Boy's carefully constructed image. By count 20, Grayson had slumped in his chair. By count 30, even his lawyers looked defeated. 43 counts, 43 guilty verdicts, the maximum possible conviction. Judge Kowalski set sentencing for 6 weeks later, denying bail. "Mr. Bell, you have been convicted of systematically defrauding investors, employees, and the public trust. You are hereby remanded to custody." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to file stories. Harsin former employees wept with relief, and Grayson Bell, the man who'd commanded boardrooms and graced magazine covers, was led away in handcuffs for the last time. Outside the courthouse, the scene was chaos. Microphones thrust in our faces. Questions shouted from every direction. Rodriguez held an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. "Today's verdict sends a clear message," he said. "Corporate executives who betray their fiduciary duties will be held accountable. No one is above the law, regardless of their name, connections, or bank account." A reporter called out, "What about the whistleblowers, the Clause Zero group?" Rodriguez smiled. Without the courage of 17 terminated employees who refused to be silenced, this crime might never have been exposed. They sacrificed their careers for the truth. That's heroism in my book. Patricia guided me away from the media scrum to a quiet corner where Jennifer Walsh from the SEC was waiting. "Congratulations, Lauren, you did it." "We did it," I corrected. "All of us." "The civil case is proceeding separately," Jennifer continued. "We're seeking full disgorgement of stolen funds plus penalties. The recovery process will take years, but every penny we find will go back to harmed investors." "What about the employees, the ones who lost their jobs when Harsin collapsed?" Jennifer's expression darkened. "That's harder. The bankruptcy trustee is trying to maximize value, possibly selling off divisions. Some jobs might be saved, but most wouldn't. That was the true tragedy. Grayson's greed hadn't just enriched himself, it had destroyed livelihoods, retirements, futures, 12,000 people paying for one man's crimes." 6 weeks later, I returned for sentencing. The courtroom was quieter this time, the media frenzy having moved on to newer scandals, but the core group was there, Clause Zero, united one last time to see justice completed. Grayson was brought in, orange jumpsuit replacing his designer suits. Prison had accelerated his transformation from golden boy to common criminal. He kept his eyes down as Judge Kowalski read her decision. "Mr. Bell, you held a position of extraordinary trust and responsibility. You betrayed that trust in the most calculating way possible. You didn't just steal money, you stole futures, security, the very faith people place in our financial systems." She detailed the harm pension funds depleted, small investors wiped out, employees cast adrift. Each word seemed to physically strike Grayson, who finally looked like he understood the magnitude of his crimes. Therefore, this court sentences you to 37 years in federal prison, plus full restitution of stolen funds and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer of any public company. 37 years, at his age, effectively a life sentence. The golden boy would grow old in a cell, his Harvard MBA worthless, his connections meaningless, his stolen millions frozen and clawed back. As they led him away, Grayson turned to scan the gallery. His eyes found mine, and for just a moment, I saw something I'd never expected understanding. He finally grasped what I'd tried to tell him in that long-ago meeting. Some rules can't be ignored. Some clauses can't be overridden. Some compliance officers can't be silenced. Outside the courthouse, the Clause Zero group gathered one final time. We'd been through hell together, bonded by shared injustice and mutual determination. Now it was over, and we could finally move on. "So what's next for everyone?" Susan Martinez asked. David Kim had launched a consulting firm helping companies strengthen their internal controls. Bradley Thompson was working for a nonprofit that supported corporate whistleblowers. Margaret Huang had returned from her self-imposed exile, taking a compliance role at a company that actually valued integrity. "I've been teaching," I said, "business ethics at the State University, using our case as a study in what happens when corporate governance fails." "Poor students," David joked, "having to learn about Section 4.2.1. They love it. Actually, I tell them about a forgotten clause that brought down a corrupt CEO, about 17 people who refuse to be victims, about how sometimes doing the right thing costs everything but pays back even more." We exchanged contact information, promised to stay in touch, knowing most of us wouldn't. We'd been soldiers in the same war, but now the war was over. Time to return to civilian life. That evening, I sat in my home office, the same room where I'd received that midnight termination email 3 years ago. So much had changed. I'd lost a career, but found a calling. Lost colleagues, but found comrades. Lost faith in one company, but gained faith in justice. My laptop showed a news alert. Former Harson CEO Grayson Bell begins serving 37-year sentence. Below it, a related story. Harson Dynamics assets acquired by competitor, saving 3,000 jobs. Not all of them, but some, a small victory salvaged from massive defeat. I pulled up the old Harson compliance manual. Digital pages worn from countless reviews during the investigation. There it was, page 47, section 4.2.1. The clause that started everything. Such a simple requirement: verify your vendors. Follow your own rules. Do the right thing. Grayson Bell thought he was too smart for simple rules. He thought innovation meant ignoring inconvenient obligations. He thought success justified any method, any shortcut, any crime. He thought wrong. I closed the laptop and looked at the framed document on my wall. The original report HD 2024-31 scene, the one that got me fired. Patricia had it professionally mounted after the trial, calling it the 6-page document that toppled an empire. But it wasn't really about the report, or the clause, or even the fraud. It was about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice, when compliance officers take their oaths seriously, when terminated employees become truth-tellers, when 17 voices become too loud to silence. My phone rang. A reporter, asking for a comment on the sentencing. "Ms. Whitfield, any final thoughts on Grayson Bell's conviction?" I thought for a moment. He gave me 2 cardboard boxes and a pink slip. I gave him 37 years and a federal conviction. I think we can call it even. The reporter laughed. "Any advice for other potential whistleblowers?" "Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find your tribe. And remember, they can fire you, but they can't fire the truth." After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto my back porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere, Grayson Bell was eating his first prison dinner. Somewhere, former Harson employees were rebuilding their lives. Somewhere, future compliance officers were learning that integrity matters. I raised my glass to the sunset, to justice served, to Section 421. The forgotten clause that refused to stay forgotten, the small rule that brought down a big criminal, the proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Understood, I whispered to the evening air, and for the first time in 3 years, I truly meant it. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate justice and the power of truth. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what you thought about Lauren's journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And if you really want to help more people discover this tale of courage against corruption, please hit the hype button to boost this video's reach. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts.